Good evening. Good evening. My name is Julia Folks, and I'd like to welcome you to the New School. It's so delightful to see such a rich and lively crowd. We're delighted to have you here. I'm a professor of history here, and my research and teaching is about New York, the arts, and the history of the New School, in fact. So both the Greenwich Village Society of Historic Preservation, which is the sponsor of this particular evening, and Mike Wallace and his many books are crucial partners in my intellectual endeavors. I was delighted to find in Professor Wallace's new book, Greater Gotham, some discussion of the Bureau of Municipal Research. That bureau, as he describes, was designed to supply experts to public affairs and civic problems, and even started up a training school for public service. In 1915, the Columbia University historian Charles Beard became director of that training school for the Municipal Bureau. But just a few years later, Charles Beard started up a new school called the New School for Social Research, which opened in 1919. And in fact, the earliest courses at the New School included ones on New York that worked with the Bureau of Municipal Research. So Greater Gotham ends just as the New School begins. Professor Wallace has assured me that the next volume includes a lot of the New School, and I'm looking forward to that. There's a lot to trace the intertwining of the school with the city through courses on architecture by Lewis Mumford in the 1920s, on housing by Charles Abrams in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and the creation of the first research institute devoted to one metropolitan region, the Center for New York City Affairs, which continues today. So please come back to the New School for all things New York, courses, degree programs, public events, and in 2019, our centenary. You can find information on all this and more at our website at newschool.edu. And now I'm introducing Ariel Cates from the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation. Ariel.
Hi, good evening. Ooh. Hello. I'm Ariel Cates. I'm the manager of programming and communications at the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation. I'm so glad that you're all here tonight for It Takes a Village, Greenwich Village 100 years ago. I'm really grateful to the New School, to Pam especially, and to Julia, who are our hosts for the evening, and to Andrew from Postman Books, who's over there selling copies of both Gotham and Greater Gotham, so pick them up at the end of the program. If you're not familiar with GVSHP and our work, we have been the community's leading advocate for preserving the cultural and architectural heritage of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo since 1980. Our work prevents inappropriate development, expands landmark protections, and engages our members and friends in programming that promotes our neighborhood's unique history and features, like tonight's program. We're a nonprofit membership-based organization, and we encourage you to get involved with and support our work. You can learn more about GVSHP and all that we do at gvshp.org and on all social media platforms. Our print materials also are outside on the table. If you didn't get them on the way in, get them on the way out. So, for the reason why we are here, Mike Wallace is Distinguished Professor of History at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and the Director of the Gotham Center for New York City History. He is the co-author of Gotham, A History of New York City to 1898, winner of the Pulitzer Prize for History. His book, Greater Gotham, captures the swings, upheavals, and communities of New York after the First World War. Here is New York on a whole new scale, moving from national to global prominence, an urban dynamo driven by restless ambition, boundless energy, immigrant dreams, and Wall Street greed. New York has always been a work in progress, writes the New York Times, but the particular years recounted in this essential, absorbing, and mostly sprightly history went a long way in shaping the pulsating city we all know. Please join me in welcoming Professor Wallace.
Start my little timer going so I keep track of things. "105 years ago, Edward Hungerford, author of a 1913 book, The Personality of American Cities, asked New York subway riders how they could tolerate being packed into cars in sardine fashion, his words. Their answers displayed a focus on speed rather than comfort. "The subway is the greatest ever," one passenger enthused. "I can come down from 72nd Street to Wall Street in 16 minutes. Clearly, the signal system was in good working order. "Where in the old days it used to take me 26 or 27 minutes by the elevated." "There," observed Hungerford, "is your real New Yorker. He would be perfectly willing to be bound and gagged and shot through a pneumatic tube like a packet of letters if he thought he could save 20 minutes between the Battery and the Harlem River." In the spirit of the early 20th century city's obsession with speed, I'm going to whisk you through my 1,200-page tome in under half an hour, hopefully, providing a nuance-free overview of some of its major propositions. Then I'll say a bit about where Greenwich Village fits into this larger picture. So grab a strap and hang on. The express is leaving the station. Various analytic threads run through the Gotham series. The volumes track the city's changing position in the global order of things. They explore its complicated relations with the nation at large, and they attend to the undulating rhythm of the business cycle, depicting the social impact of an economy that lurched repeatedly from boom to bust and back again to boom, often by way of war. This volume begins in 1898 with the economy roaring back to life after the terrible depression of the 1890s and embarking on a decade-long boom. The flush times were abruptly ended by a 1907 panic triggered by speculative shenanigans on the New York Stock Exchange. The economy then entered upon a 7-year stretch of sputtering recession with bouts of severe unemployment and mass homelessness, ended only by the 1914 outbreak of war in Europe and a subsequent tsunami of buy orders for weaponry. Now, the first portion, the 1898 to 1907 boom, had multiple sources, but at its core was the wholesale reconstruction of American capitalism engineered by such financial and industrial titans as J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller. The two New Yorkers were as chalk and cheese. They grated badly on one another's nerves. But they were as one in their profound antipathy to free market capitalism. Cutthroat competition between firms generated price wars, which lowered profits, which led the combatants to slash wages, which spurred the growth of unions and strikes, which were countered by governmental and private repression, which strengthened a growing socialist challenge to the capitalist system itself. Madness, they thought. This is no way to run a railroad. Their solution was to wring as much competition as possible from the economic order. This was accomplished with amazing speed by the great merger wave of 1898 to 1904, in which thousands of competitive enterprises were consolidated into hundreds of giant corporations, with United States Steel the preeminent example. Most housed their headquarters in the skyscrapers that now erupted from lower Manhattan's bedrock. "The city is simply bursting its bonds," wrote Harper's Weekly. "It is as if some mighty force were astir beneath the ground, hour by hour, pushing up structures that a dozen years ago would have been inconceivable." The corporate class also despised what it considered to be the lunatic political competition between the cities and towns clustered around the harbor, preeminently New York and Brooklyn, the nation's first and fourth largest metropoli. These rivals should have been working together to solve common problems like cleaning up the harbor or lengthening the piers or fending off Chicago's demographic challenge. Leaders of the industrial financial elite therefore took the lead in arranging the 1898 merger of the competing jurisdictions into the megalopolis called Greater New York, hence my tome's title, Greater Gotham. In the ensuing 2 decades, the corporate elite and municipal authorities set out to make consolidation a fact on the ground, not just on paper. Bridges were thrown across rivers, subways were dug beneath the landscape, conduits brought water and power to the super city. The populace swiftly expanded into its enormous terrain. Real estate developers de-agriculturalized Brooklyn, planting middle-class subdivisions instead of cabbages. The still largely bucolic Bronx was rapidly transformed into what would have been, had it been independent, the 6th largest city in the United States. External links were also strengthened to the nation and the world by land and by sea. Railway tunnels afforded direct access to new or refurbished transcontinental stations. Let me just see here. It's a little fuzzy, but you can see on this 1912 Hammond's bird's eye map, well, you can't see probably, I can barely see. Pennsylvania Station arced with gleaming letters and Grand Central Station. The Chelsea piers are also visible. There are the new docks that were built to handle Titanic-sized vessels. The massive Bush terminal offered a novel merger of manufacturing and shipping operations. Consolidation promoted gargantualization. Already the nation's preeminent industrial center, corporate complexes in oil and sugar swelled in size, as did factories making bread, boxes, soap, autos, and armaments. Even the garment industry, while remaining hyper-competitive, shifted from cramped sweatshops to expansive lofts like that of the Triangle Shirtwaist Company. Department stores grew in size and magnificence as they relocated from Ladies' Mile to Fifth Avenue. Giant hotels mushroomed around the Midtown train stations, and super-luxurious versions blossomed on Fifth Avenue. Cultural institutions, too, merged and grew, like the Astor, Lenox, and Tilden libraries, which consolidated themselves into the New York Public Library, which housed itself in Beaux-Arts splendor. The city's colleges mutated into universities. Hospitals morphed into medical centers. In the culture industries, Gotham cemented its position as the nation's print media capital, hosting as it did scores of newspapers, the leading national magazines, and virtually all the major book publishers whose collective presses supported the city's vast printing industry. Impresarios of theater, vaudeville, and the fledgling motion picture industry consolidated their businesses, which grew in size and scale. A gigantic entertainment complex arose in Longacre Square, center of the city's horse and carriage trade. Formerly dim and dangerous at night, it was swiftly transformed by the likes of Oscar Hammerstein, the Astor family, the New York Times, and the IRT into a congeries of palatial Broadway theaters, vaudeville houses, movie palaces, lobster palaces, all brilliantly illuminated by Oscar Good's electric signage. Times Square's wattage was rivaled only by the million-bulb blaze afforded by the Coney Island amusements that merged into scintillating pleasure domes like Luna Park and Dreamland. The great skyscrapers were themselves a product of the consolidation revolution in construction and financing. Harry Black, responsible for building the Flatiron Building, together with Paul Sterrett, one of the 5 Sterrett brothers who collectively seem to have produced every major structure in the city in this period. But what they did was to, in fact, overcome the traditional methods of construction, which assembled in small pieces people who worked in stonework, people who worked in elevators, etc., and created general contractors who, in fact, took responsibility for doing the entire building and oversaw the work of the subdivisions. the skyscrapers took a huge amount of money to build, and that too was solved by a consolidation mechanism. Henry Morgenthau, later senior, was one of the pioneers in this. He started off very small, buying a few brownstones, reselling them, buying bigger ones, reselling them. He became a very canny judge of real estate values, particularly figuring out how land values were going to accelerate if a subway line went through or whatever. He rose to the top of the real estate developer pinnacle, but there was a bigger challenge still that they had, which was convincing the real masters of capital, the insurance companies, the big banks, etc., that it was okay to invest in real estate. They had been chary of this, the money people. This seemed frozen capital. You couldn't get your money in or out. And Morgenthau pointed out all they had to do was create a real estate corporation that itself took responsibility for assembling the financing and overseeing construction. And then you could always sell your shares and get out if it wasn't working. So between the two of them, they put together something called United States Realty. If you see a corporation that's prefaced by United States or General or Standard, there's no guarantee, but the odds are high that they date to this 20-year period. Okay. This Promethean frenzy of construction was spellbinding and seemingly proof positive that the consolidated megalopolis worked. Measured by metrics that stressed efficiency, productivity, and private profitability, Greater Gotham did indeed seem a resounding success. But there were other scales on which one measured the attained degree of civic and social justice and assessed the attention paid to enhancing the common weal. A considerable portion of the book is devoted to the era's tumultuous conflicts over New York's social, cultural, economic, and political arrangements. We have time for only a glance at 4 of the era's battlegrounds, whose combatants were divided along lines of class, ethnicity, race, and gender. First, class. There was, as always, a stupendous disparity of condition among the city's millions in the distribution of wealth and power and the degree of access to social goods like healthcare, housing, or education. With the rise of the super-rich corporate elite and their affluent professional managerial associates, the chasm that yawned between Fifth Avenue and the Bowery had never seemed less bridgeable. Nevertheless, the era was impressive for the variety of reform movements that sought to redress inequalities and inequities. Labor unions representing skilled workers, chiefly older immigrants, English, Irish, German, concentrated on winning the right to organize the workplace and using the economic muscle thus attained to fight for the 8-hour day, a minimum wage, the abolition of child labor, and improved workplace safety. The newer immigrants, notably Jews and Italians, organized industry-wide unions, particularly in the garment trade, and launched enormous strikes. They also supported the Socialist Party's strategy of seeking political power through the ballot, with the goal of establishing minimum standards for wages and working conditions. The Socialists, a serious political presence, also called for providing as rights, not commodities, day nurseries, free school lunches, public libraries, fireproof tenement housing, their costs to be paid from the public purse. Similarly, middle-class progressives based in settlement houses and social gospel churches favored establishment by law of minimum standards for worker housing. They fought, too, for social insurance programs like those widely deployed in Europe, notably England and Germany, such as workmen's compensation, which they won, and health insurance, which was beaten back by doctors, insurance companies, and organized business groups. To deal with capitalism's inevitable downturns, progressives proposed, but failed to win, unemployment insurance. Socialists urged hiring the unemployed to build highways, schools, and other public works, which was rejected. And jobless wobblies, members of the industrial workers of the world, opted for direct action, as in the frigid winter of 1914, when a so-called army of the unemployed marched from one church to another, seeking food and shelter for the night, and often finding it. Second, ethnicity. The period experienced a mammoth surge of immigration. After merger created the supercity of 3 million, by 1920 it was roughly 5 million. Newcomers settled into pre-existing or newly created ethnic enclaves, which were large enough to sustain native language culture. They slotted themselves, too, into the ethnic niches into which the economy was divided. Irish, transport; Italians, construction; Jews, garments; Anglos, banks. The city's cellularity allowed it to house, cheek by jowl, millions of people from wildly differing backgrounds. Now, this was not new. The city had long been a consummate practitioner of multinationalism, but now it acquired an appreciation, even an ideology, of what was commonly called cosmopolitanism. The word cosmopolitan was invented for us, one guidebook boasted. Rome, in her palmiest days, never knew what wide worldliness was compared with New York. Another crowed that it would be hard to find an important race that has no representation in New York. The city has become a Congress of Nations in permanent session. More profoundly, Randolph-born civic activist, intellectual, hailed the U.S. as an unplanned, quote, cosmopolitan federation of national colonies, a place where for the first time in history has been achieved that miracle of hope, the peaceful living side by side with character substantially preserved of the most heterogeneous peoples under the sun. America, Bourne asserted, quote, is a unique sociological fabric, and it bespeaks poverty of imagination not to be thrilled at the incalculable potentialities of so novel a union of men. But an important segment of New Yorkers were not thrilled in the slightest. They were perfectly appalled. The descendants of Anglo-Protestant forebears believed they were entitled to primacy of place by right of cultural primogeniture, and they felt threatened by the flood of alien newcomers. The old stock American, bewailed Madison Grant, quote, is today being literally driven off the streets of New York City by the swarms of Polish Jews. These immigrants wear his clothes, they steal his name, and they are beginning to take his women, which would no doubt produce many amazing racial hybrids and some ethnic horrors that will be beyond the powers of future anthropologists to unravel. Some of those who recoiled from heterogeneity demanded the coercive imposition of Anglo-uniformity. There is no room in this country for hyphenated Americanism, thundered Theodore Roosevelt. Francis Keller proposed a, quote, conscious effort to forge the people in this country into an American race, after which there will be no German Americans, no Italian Quarter, no East Side Jew, no Uptown Ghetto. Others, influenced by eugenicists and race scientists, believed that Jews and Italians and Caribbean blacks were biologically inferior, hence not reformable. Indeed, were polluting the city's gene pool and would drag their superiors down. Those who believed with W.E.D. Stokes, a real estate developer who built the Ansonia, that, quote, we cannot forever absorb this influx of the scum of the earth, this off-scouring, diseased, imported blood with its evil customs, signed up with the forthrightly named Immigration Restriction League and prodded Congress to pass a, quote, genuine 100% American immigration law, which they would do, but not until the third volume. Third, race. For African Americans, the period began with a race riot, a term still reserved for whites assaulting blacks. In 1900, throngs of Irish residents howling, "Lynch the niggers," mobbed 8th Avenue trolleys, dragged blacks off, beat them with lead pipes. Groups of young white men raced up and down the West 20s and 30s, screaming with rage at black sons of bitches, hunting and stomping victims. Finally, however, the police force arrived and promptly joined the rioters, smashing heads with nightsticks, shooting at tenement windows, and dragging blacks to the 37th Street station house where they were kicked, punched, and clubbed into insensibility. The city's African-American community demanded an investigation, but the grand jury refused to indict anyone. A New York Police Department internal review exonerated the accused officers, instead commended them for their, quote, prompt and vigorous action. The real offenders, tortuously explained the police commissioner, were the Negroes who insisted in getting into the disorderly crowds that were pursuing them. The city's economy and culture were de facto Jim Crowed. Black men and women were consigned to the lowest rung jobs. Tin Pan Alley coon songs nourished a culture of contempt, while Birth of a Nation lauded the KKK. Yet voices of resistance rang out with increasing volume. W.E.B. Du Bois, editor of the NAACP's Crisis magazine, issued harshly eloquent editorials. A. Philip Randolph, Hubert Harrison, Marcus Garvey, and black church pastors proposed pathways of resistance to racism. But perhaps the most important improvement came with the creation of Black Harlem, as tens of thousands of migrants and immigrants regrouped from elsewhere and built for the first time a defensible enclave on the order of those formed by other populations. Blacks had never had terrain of their own. They had little snippets of territory. Here in this neck of the woods, relatively, they concentrated Little Africa in just to the south of Washington Square in the Monetas. And many of them whom worked for the people who owned the big houses on Washington Square North. Then they were exited by the arrival of large numbers of Italians, transformation of the neighborhood. They moved up to the 30s and the 40s, and then they moved up to San Juan Hill in the 50s and 60s. And after the riot, when in addition to the injuries of the affair was the arrival of the subway. And the subway roars up the west side, goes up north, hangs a right under Central Park, and emerges to go up Lenox Avenue. And Lenox Avenue and 135th Street Station becomes ground zero for the entrepreneurs of black real estate to make their mark. White property owners called for forging, quote, a powerful anti-invasion movement to check the progress of the black hordes that are gradually eating through the very heart of Harlem. One proposed building a 24-foot-high wall along West 136th Street to keep blacks from moving north, but nothing had worked, and never again would whites dream of invading black New York. Fourth, gender. The period brought epical changes to the city's gender order. The tremendous expansion of Gotham's industrial, commercial, and cultural sectors offered a wider range of jobs than the traditionally female-coded options of teaching, nursing, domestic labor, and the sex trades. Corporate headquarters and business services needed legions of clerical workers. Department stores wanted salesgirls, restaurants, waitresses, hotels, maids, the garment industry, seamstresses. Journalism, publishing, and the fashion and theatrical industries offered women creative positions. The, quote, new woman tag captured a new sensibility that was also made manifest in collective action. The great women's strikes in the garment trade both inspired and drew strength from the largely middle and upper-class suffrage movement, forging a multi-class coalition. Their triumphal victory in winning the right to vote in New York State came in November 1917, almost now exactly 100 years ago, or past it now, and was the critical breakthrough that led to passage of the 19th Amendment. Feminists, a new word, like the members of the Greenwich Village Heterodoxy Club, a self-described little band of willful women, fought for women's right to control their bodies. Margaret Sanger led the charge to overcome Anthony Comstock's hammerlock on even mentioning birth control, much less practicing it. And from her efforts would arise Planned Parenthood. We're approaching our terminus now. So we'll have to whip through the First World War, the volume's final part. 2 points in passing about the run-up to the war. The lines of division between those who wanted the U.S. to get into the war and those who wanted it to stay out paralleled almost precisely the city's internal lines of division. In ethnic terms, the Anglo-Protestant community was overwhelmingly in favor of backing England and the Allied powers. But the city's Germans had no interest in warring with Germany. The Irish loathed the British Empire, and the Jews were repelled by Tsarist pogroms. In class terms, the Wall Street elite, virtually coterminous with the Anglo-Protestant community, was a powerful force for intervention on behalf of Britain, while the Socialist Party and its working-class constituents were resolutely opposed. The 1914-1917 battle over maintaining neutrality grew ever more vitriolic because foreign stances overlapped with domestic antagonisms. The other point, the profits from selling arms and foodstuffs were so enormous that they altered the global balance of financial power. In 1914, though an industrial superpower, the United States was still a debtor nation, owing Europeans roughly $4 billion. At first, the Allies paid for their purchases by shipping gold, but the gold wasn't enough. So the Europeans sold off at the New York Stock Exchange the stock holdings that accumulated over 50 years of investment in U.S. railroads, mines, factories, and farms. But it wasn't enough. So they began borrowing, especially from the House of Morgan. And by war's end, the United States had become a creditor nation. Now it was the Europeans who owed roughly $4 billion. And New York City, as was widely noted, had been lofted to a position from which it could challenge London for the status of financial capital of the world. I have to flash by the 1918 war year station, shooting past the federal government's equation of dissent and hyphenism with sedition or treason, while also making concessions to progressives, unionists, and women activists. I must zip past the interplay between the city's diverse demography and its premier military units, black, white, elite, and multinational. We must zoom by the 1919 Red Scare station, a ferocious battle over the future of the country and the city, fought out in the streets and culminating with a colossal dynamite bomb being set off right in front of the Exchange and the House of Morgan. And so we arrive at our terminus, completing the first leg of our journey from 1898 to 1919 in 29 minutes and 22 seconds. Now, I don't know whether we should take a seventh inning stretch here, or if they still do seventh inning stretches. But I want to shift the altitude and zoom in on Greenwich Village, which is the co-sponsor of this evening. Okay. I want to start by, and again, this is much closer to the ground and may take longer than my allotted time span, which I'll keep an eye on and terminate at the first sign of approaching the boundary line. I want to start by recounting two episodes which provide a critical piece of the context out of which the Greenwich Village phenomena emerges. On April 10th, 1906, Maxim Gorky's ship docked at the North German Lloyd Pier in Hoboken. There, the famous author was greeted by thousands in a tumultuous reception. Immensely popular in the States for his writings and his resistance to Tsarist despotism, Gorky had come to raise money for revolution in Russia. Metropolitan luminaries, including Mark Twain and William Dean Howells, planned gala receptions, mass meetings, a White House visit. Gorky was whisked to a suite at the Hotel Belclair at 77th and Broadway. For the next few days, the city was his. Twain hailed him at a literary stag dinner. He was driven by auto through Central Park, taken to Grant's tomb, dined at the St. Regis, treated to a circus at Madison Square Garden. A front-page headline read, "Gorky amazed at New York's greatness." On Saturday the 14th, however, the World bannered a very different story. Acting on a tip from the Tsarist Russian embassy, and out of fury that Gorky had granted an exclusive to Hearst's American, Joseph Pulitzer's paper reported that the woman traveling with the distinguished visitor was not Madame Gorky, but, quote, an actress. One Maria Andreeva, who was indeed a star of the Moscow Art Theater, as well as a leading figure with Gorky in the Lenin-led Bolshevik wing of the Social Democratic Party. Brutal ostracism followed. The Belclair bounced the pair. Gorky and Andreeva were then checked into the French-themed Lafayette Brevoort Hotel downtown on Fifth Avenue between 8th and 9th Street, supposedly a more sophisticated venue, popular with visiting Europeans. But early that evening, the couple was ejected again. They were then transferred to the Rhinelander apartments just across the street, a seemingly safe harbor, and went out for a night on the town. They returned after midnight to find their luggage piled up in the lobby. The two were finally given refuge at the A Club, virtually next door at number 3 Fifth Avenue between 8th Street and Washington Square. The A Club was a cooperative rooming house recently established in an old mansion by a collection of socialists and settlement workers. As most for writers of one sort or another, the club was also something of a literary watering hole. Twain, then living nearby at 21 Fifth, was a frequent visitor. The residents were also ardent supporters of the 1905 revolution, and indeed the club was a principal sponsor of Gorky's trip. Members had gotten advance word from Russia that Gorky would be traveling with Andreeva and had tried to dissuade him, knowing the temper of the town, but he indignantly refused to reconsider. He had, after all, been living with Andreeva since he and his wife had separated some years before, amicably but illegally, as the Orthodox Church refused divorces to men in the revolutionary camp. And in Russia, theirs was considered a respectable common law marriage. At first, A clubbers had managed to convince the New York press to sit on the story, lest a short-circuit what promised to be weeks of juicy, high-profile coverage of Gorky's U.S. tour. But the Tsarist Russian embassy was bombarding editors with pictures of Gorky's, quote, deserted, quote, wife and child, and the New York Herald publisher James Gordon Bennett Jr., now in his 60s and living in Paris with a young Russian countess, was reported to have ordered an expose. So Pulitzer went with the story, and the 8 clubbers' worst fears were instantly realized. Doors slammed all over Manhattan as against a carrier of moral plague. Meetings and dinners were canceled. Twain resigned as Gorky's chief promoter. President Roosevelt refused to see him. In Boston, a Faneuil Hall rally was called off by organizers after they received the, quote, horrid news lest the pro-revolutionary movement by association alienate, quote, all Americans who love decency. Some supporters spoke out. Professor at Columbia, John Dewey, and his wife gave a tea party in honor of Madame Andreeva at their 431 Riverside Drive apartment, attended to much tut-tutting by some of Dewey's Barnard students. But by and large, the embargo held. Harper's Weekly considered the affair, quote, evidence of the irresponsibility which lurks at the bottom of the mind that is capable of accepting the socialistic program. And the Presbyterian suggested that Americans had best, quote, realize that worse things for Russia might be in store than having a czar for a ruler. Gorky, for his part, found shelter at a private home on Staten Island and occupied himself crafting a revenge essay, City of the Yellow Devil. From the harbor, Gorky wrote, quote, the city seems like a vast jaw with uneven black teeth. It breathes clouds of black smoke into the sky and snuffles like a glutton suffering from his obesity. The monstrous metropolis, Gorky fancied, gorged on its citizens. They were sluiced along via the city's deep gutters, quote, somewhere into the heart of the city where one imagines there must be a vast bottomless hole, a cauldron or a pan into which all these people pour and are boiled down into gold. Twain was uncomfortable at his role. He blamed Gorky for ignoring local mores. Custom, he argued, is built of brass, boiler iron, granite, and facts, reasonings, arguments have no more effect upon it than the idle winds have upon Gibraltar. Rightly or wrongly, he said, quote, laws are sand, customs are rock. Laws can be evaded and punishment escape, but an openly transgressed custom brings sure punishment. But Gorky's reception did not signal a moral machinery in good working order. Quite the opposite. By the early 20th century, traditional gender conventions were in serious disrepair and under serious attack. Gorky's treatment was a skirmish in an emerging war over manners and morals, a nationwide struggle in which New York City, and particularly Greenwich Village, would be a crucial battleground. Second last shorter episode. This one involving a different terrain, which was state intervention to regulate cultural behavior. In August 1906, with Gorky still on the scene, though consigned by Coventry to polite society, Comstock arrested just let's check out of curiosity, how many people know who Anthony Comstock was? I'm pleased to see he has slipped down the memory hole. It's a long story, told in volume 1, so I don't get to repeat much of it here. But Anthony Comstock, we'll skip his personal biography, although it's fascinating, was able to get, with the backing of very powerful New Yorkers, including Morgan and his confreres, the passage in 1873 of what became known as the Comstock Law, which basically gave Anthony Comstock, via the authority of the Postmaster General, the right to ban from the mails, and worse, anything that was obscene. And the definition of obscenity was whatever Anthony Comstock said it was. And he steadily expanded his purview from fealty pictures to information about birth control, which inherently was considered to be an obscenity. But he went after publishers, including the biggest, who'd walk into an editor's office and arrest them. He went after art institutions, with this one as my example. In August 1906, Comstock arrested the 19-year-old receptionist of the Art Students League of New York on 57th Street. She herself was impeccably respectable, but she gave him a free catalog that contained 3 images of nudes. Comstock then seized all 2,500 copies of the issue. In an early warning sign that he was falling somewhat out of step with a substantial portion of middle-class opinion, many in the press cracked wise about his latest crusade. Stories made sarcastic reference to the purifier and countered his accusations of obscenity with contrary findings from art experts, including the head of the Metropolitan Museum. Comstock gave a bit of ground, saying that while allowing the catalog, quote, in the home, where it may suggest impure thoughts, was unthinkable and punishable. Nevertheless, if, quote, they keep their nude pictures in the studios where they belong, we shall not molest them. But Comstock still had his supporters. The New York Times agreed that such material should not be available through the mail, and he still held the law on his side, had the law on his side. It was, after all, his law. In the end, to get him to drop the charges, the ASL was forced to burn all 2,500 books. One of my favorite images in Greater Gotham is on page 760 for those who have come or will burden themselves with the volume, which has the official seal of the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, which is Comstock's organization. And it's got 2 pictures. One of them is a miscreant being led manacled off to a jail cell. And on the other side, a respectable gentleman in top hat throwing books onto a bonfire. Comstock, by the way, had sufficient clout to make even J.P. Morgan think twice about crossing him. Also in 1906, Morgan backed off buying and importing Degas' Le Viol, The Rape, explaining that, quote, it would be open to objections from the Comstockians, and that we ought not at present to face that particular music. Comstock's principal opponent was Emma Goldman, who developed a theoretical cultural historical critique of not just Comstock, but what she considered to be the dominance of what she called Puritanism. Coming out of a dramatically different cultural tradition and drawing politically on a libertarian version of anarchism with American as well as European roots, her opinions were strongly grounded, and she had the means of propagating them via her widely read magazine Mother Earth and her annual nationwide lecture tour. The question was, would there actually be a conversation, or would the forces of order succeed again in silencing her and other voices of protest? There would indeed be a conversation over the next few years, principally because Goldman would be joined in tackling the wobbling gender order by a cadre and then a crowd of cultural rebels dedicated, among other things, to contesting Puritanism and all its works. A community would emerge, spatially rooted in its own enclave, a secured base of operations to which would flock recruits from all around the country. This community of cultural activists would call for jettisoning old gender constraints and forging new ways for women and men to be together. In the name of freedom of speech and the emancipation of women, they would directly combat the use of the state to support the old order. Like the movement for sexual revanchism, the movement for sexual revolution would flourish in New York City. Okay, now I'm going to start abbreviating here, give you the gist of the argument. I've used the word enclave repeatedly in various different contexts in the cities in this period. But I think what's important to note is the degree to which, because New York was New York, Gothamic neighborhood names became nationally, even internationally, recognized as synecdoches, stand-ins for national level functions indelibly associated with the metropolis. So, Wall Street, finance, Madison Avenue, advertising. Times Square, entertainment. Fifth Avenue, both high society and great department stores. Union Square, economic and political radicalism. Broadway, theater, movies. Coney Island, amusement parks. Ellis Island, immigration. And the Bowery, poverty. These enclaves grew with enormous speed. Times Square, for instance, I mean, it really had been empty, dark, dangerous. And within 4 years, from 1900, when the Times basically decides to move uptown from Printing House Square, to 1904, when the IRT arrives in the station, and the first, that December 31st, the first New Year's Eve is celebrated with lights and bonfires and the rest. 4 years flat, and it just kept exploding. The number of theaters, the number of restaurants, the number of lobster palaces, etc. The Fifth Avenue department stores. I mean, it was like somebody fired a gun, and all the department stores that were lined up on Ladies Mile, 6th Avenue between 14th Street, here we are, between 14th Street and 23rd Street, and like a flock of startled geese, they all picked up and roamed north and east and descended on the 34th Street to 59th Street, 5th Avenue corridor, virtually overnight. The Bowery, which shifted swiftly from being the working class entertainment district to being what one scholar called in 1914 Povertyville. I think Greenwich Village falls under this rubric of function-related enclave, as opposed to ethnic enclaves, which are demographic phenomena. But it had a different route that it took to get there. Before there was an enclave, there was an idea of an enclave, the notion that there should be a liberated zone from which assaults could be launched against the surrounding status quo. The model was Bohemia, a name that had gotten attached to the Sorbonne student quarter on the left bank of the Seine in Paris, when artists, writers, musicians, actors, and journalists clustered there in the 1840s. In the early 1900s, New Yorkers discovered to their amazement that a real Latin Quarter had materialized in Manhattan, a community packed with literary societies, theaters, lecture halls, discussion groups, and cafes where students, artists, scholars, and writers argued passionately late into the night about philosophy, literature, and politics. But this was no second-hand imitation of a legendary Paris, but the supremely authentic Lower East Side. And the denizens debating the relative merits of Gorky, Zola, Tolstoy, Gogol, Chernyshevsky, and Whitman were arguing vigorously over anarchism, socialism, Zionism, and free love were not wannabe Bohemians, but Russian Jews. Now, admirable though the Lower East Side Bohemia might be, it belonged to others from the perspective of those, chiefly Anglo-Protestants, who were attracted to the notion of an enclave community, but they needed something of their own. The A Club was a step in that direction. Established in the wake of the 1905 revolution, it had deliberately opted for proximity to the roiling Lower East Side scene. Helen Todd, the wealthy settlement worker who bankrolled the purchase, said they took the house at number 3 Fifth Avenue because, quote, it is only a short distance from the ghetto. And the proximity was political as well as physical. The members were deeply involved with the Russian cause and functioned as something of an American press bureau for visiting revolutionaries, most notably Gorky. The club was both a political and social community, recalled resident Mary Heaton Vorse. It was the first time, she wrote, that I had been in a large group of like-minded people who questioned the system under which they lived. Everyone, quote, was a liberal, if not a radical, and all for labor and the arts. Most of the women who lived at the A Club between 1906 and 1910 participated in actions by the Women's Trade Union League. The cooperative living arrangements were also unusual. The club housed both singles and married couples and hosted an informal running salon where artists and writers constantly dropping by, along with visiting radical celebrities like labor organizers Mother Jones. Boris fondly remembered, quote, "the mutual kindness and the gaiety of our household. It was, she felt, a completely successful and civilized experiment in communal living." The A Club, half a block north of Washington Square, would prove a stepping stone into Greenwich Village, the neighborhood that would emerge as New York's Bohemia. Now, this is beyond us to sort of probe deeply into this, but Greenwich Village, which was far bigger than the radical component, was, like almost everything else in this period, under tremendous transformation. There was an enormous number of Italians moving in, a substantial number of African Americans moving out and farther north and west. The Irish community maintained its stronghold on the western side. The Anglo-Protestant Rhinelander family and even the various mayors lived on the north part of the square. But there was a space in the middle that lay between Washington and Sheridan Squares. And it's into that territory, which was downwardly mobile and rents were downwardly affordable. It began trickling in from around the country during the 1910s. Most were young, white, and Protestant men and women of middle-class status and modest or occasionally sizable means. College grads, disaffected from Victorian values and life in the provinces. People who saw themselves as a class apart, in need of a place apart. For them, all signs pointed to New York City. Gotham seemed the preeminent site of modern possibilities, the perfect place from which to revolt against the century. It was the dynamic nucleus of the corporate revolution, pulsing with wealth and power, a cosmopolis teeming with foreign cultures, seemingly more vital than desiccated Anglophilia. A radical city, bustling with socialists, unionists, progressives, anarchists, and gender reformers like Emma Goldman. A literary and artistic marketplace and hub of the culture and head of the publishing industries wherein they might find employment as writers, artists, and journalists, as intellectuals able to live by their wits and talents. Within Gotham, Greenwich Village seemed the perfect greenhouse for would-be rebels, a small-town community in the skyscraper metropolis, manageable, not alienating, reportedly receptive to Bohemian experiments with new ways of living. It was off the moral and physical grid. Now, I think I'm not going to do the last section in all of its details, partly because it's very familiar. Intellectuals, John Reed, Vorse herself, Susan Glassbill, a long list of familiar names, filtered into the village at this time, attracted by the low rents. Because these were cold water flats, they tended to congregate in bars or coffee shops. But then something happened, reached a certain critical mass, not that many people, but a mass of energy out of which precipitated one institution after another. Polly's place on McDougal Street became the center of I'll give you this. In 1913, Paula Holliday, an anarchist from Evanston, opened a downstairs restaurant at 137 McDougal between 3rd and 4th. The idea had been suggested by her Czech anarchist lover, Hippolyte Havel, who had been Goldman's lover too. And he wanted a nucleus around which scattered radicals could coalesce. Polly's proved to be just the gravitational force Havel had envisioned when the celebrated Liberal Club moved in one flight up. The club had begun life as a discussion society for progressive New Yorkers, and its meeting had been held in the Gramercy Park area, the center of progressive movements, clustered around the United Charities building on 22nd Street. In 1913, a split developed when the majority refused opening membership to African Americans and declined to let Emma Goldman speak. An exodus ensued of members down to the village, shifting from the progressive to the radical city. On the floor above Polly's, they set up a, quote, meeting place for those interested in new ideas. Here, writers and artists drank wine, talked politics with Emma and Big Bill Haywood, listened to Horace Traubel reminisce about Walt Whitman, the village's patron saint, and danced the tango in new ragtime steps. The next act, and the next act, and the next act followed in rapid succession. The complex expanded again when Albert and Charles Boney opened the Washington Square bookshop at the adjacent 135 McDougal. I should mention, because the material underpinning is worth noting, the row of brownstones, or small wannabe brownstones, from 139 to 133 to 139 McDougal Street, were owned by the Ferrari sisters, Jenny and Mary Ferrari. Their mother had run a successful grocery store and made enough money to set her two daughters up in business. They ran a men's furnishing store on Bleecker Street, which made lots of money, and they decided to invest their capital in real estate and bought up much of this stretch of McDougal. And one after another, like homing pigeons, organizations flocked into their waiting landlady arms. They gave permission, in this case, to the Boneys to cut a doorway between their emporium and the Liberal Club. This not only allowed club members and writer visitors to circulate freely, it enhanced the flow of ideas about what kinds of books should be sold and, more important, published. In 1913, in conjunction with poet Alfred Kraimberg, a frequenter of the Liberal Club, the Boneys began publishing The Glebe, a little magazine, circulation 300, dedicated to, quote, the best work of American and foreign authors. The February 1914 issue included material by Ezra Pound, Amy Lowell, William Carlos Williams, and the as yet unknown James Joyce. Meanwhile, back at 137, Polly's had become the venue of choice for the luncheon club called Heterodoxy, as we said. An outfit, according to one member, was a club for women who did things and did them openly. Its members included authors and journalists, doctors and lawyers, teachers and settlement workers, psychologists and anthropologists, playwrights and actresses, unionists and radicals. Nearly all were economically independent, a few were well off, and at bi-weekly meetings they discussed issues of the day, their own work, and their own personal affairs. Famously, when O'Neill and company formed the Provincetown Players and were looking for a venue, the Ferrari sisters once again opened the door, first rejiggering the parlor floor of 139, and then when they needed more space, taking the 133 building, which had been an old stable, and ready it for the brilliant career of American theater. One could go on. The masses arrive on Greenwich Street, the involvement with politics as well as culture with the Patterson pageant or the admixture of the two. Salons like Mabel Dodge's, Margaret Sanger's entering the lists along with Emma Goldman against Anthony Comstock. The Wobblies were in town. The village that, in fact, everybody knows. I think that is a good place to stop. So I will. It was, for the record, part 2, 29 minutes and 51 seconds. Okay, now I understand Q&A is on deck, so anybody who wants to Q, I will attempt to A. One thing to keep in mind, is there a free-floating mic? I should have raised this before. Oh, good. Because of all of my various failing faculties, hearing seems to be in the lead. So I have computers in my ear, but sometimes they're overtaxed.
Could you tell us something about the A Club? Why was it called that, and whose mansion was it in?
I forget who owned the mansion. It could have been one of the Rhinelanders because they owned several properties in the neighborhood. And there's conflicting reports about this. Somebody, I forget the name, when they were racking their brains about what to call it, said, oh, well, why don't we just call it a club? A club. And this was so decided. But you can't say the club. Although, I don't know, maybe they did. Yes.
Where did the name Gotham come from?
Okay. Gotham was and is a completely inconsequential little village, a real one, in England near Sherwood Forest of Robin Hood fame. And it had nothing distinctive about it whatsoever, except for the fact that for some reason, one never knows how this chemistry works out, it was nominated to be the village of idiots. In the 13th, 14th, 15th century, chapbooks floated around the countryside with jokes, Gotham jokes, about how stupid they were. Shakespeare apparently read one of these. So how did it get from there to here? Well, in the 1820s, oh dear, am I going to forget his name? Washington Irving was a young Brat Pack type journalist who was writing snotty essays about how impossible the rich were, basically. He had a critical edge then. And so he, to put them down, cast them as being residents of the ancient town of Gotham, i.e. morons. So why did it become a nickname for New York? Good question. The answer is that it actually fit with a lot of New Yorkers' self-conception about being shrewd traders who were able to, zap the Indians for $24 or sell the Brooklyn Bridge to the yokels. Actually, the Brooklyn Bridge in this period was sold repeatedly. And owners would rush to put up a toll booth so that they could collect from the passing strangers and were startled when they were ushered off by the police department. But that also computes with another aspect of the Gotham mythology, which was one day King John or King Joe or King somebody was on his way with his knights to pass through Gotham, and the rules of the game were that anywhere the royal feet tread or trod became the private property of the royal foot and head. So when the Gothamites hear that the king is coming, they say, you can't come. They send word. King says, what? I can't come? And he sends a squadron of knights to level the place. But when he gets there, all the Gothamites are doing really absurd things, like painting green apples red, or putting a fence around a bird without a roof when it then flew away, and more stupidities, but in this case, pretending to be stupid in order to get their way. That too computed well with New Yorkers' self-esteem. And Gotham has waxed and waned as a popular attribution until, whatever it was, 39, when the location of the Batman saga was settled. Actually, they really meant it to be New York, but they were afraid that they would lose market share if Milwaukee felt that this wasn't their story as well. And ever since, it's been a nickname. I sort of was hoping that people would think that both books were really about the Caped Crusader and would make an impulse buy. More than you ever wanted to know about. What else we got? I've outlasted you. Okay, well, thank you so much. Oh, wait.
Got one more. When did Comstock die, and how did the people, the radicals in Greenwich Village, escape his suppression or whatever you want to do to them?
Well, it wasn't only the radicals who escaped. It's a very complicated story. First of all, he died after winning a court decision against Margaret Sanger. The strain of the trial had just, was the last ounce of strength, so he died happy. But Sanger made a deal with the devil. Sanger comes up before she's into birth control. She's an all-purpose radical, living in the village, working closely with the IWW, was an all-purpose radical. When that became clear that that was going to be unsustainable, she made a political shift. And she made common cause with very wealthy and powerful women who were equally obsessed about not having control of themselves. And the deal was, although she had one last radical gesture, which was not even gesture, a very important moment in New York history. She set up in Brownsville a clinic where women could come to get birth control information. Not a single doctor in the city male of course, would participate in the project. It was she and her sister. This was suppressed. Her sister was force-fed in prison. It was bad business. And she shifted to a deal which said, okay, we're going to allow the passage of legislation which is going to decriminalize information about birth control, but only if doctors prescribe. And one of the major support for this program was that it's going to save men from venereal disease, which was rampant. So she made an alliance with upper middle class women and was launched off in the direction of Planned Parenthood. And in the 20s, although it's out of our territory here, she signed on sort of to the notion that this was a way of preventing the lower classes from excessive breeding. This was Teddy Roosevelt's shtick, that the new immigrants are simply more fecund than white middle-class women who were letting down the side. Their rate of children was dropping steadily, and he wanted to reverse this, get 4 or 5 children. If we're going to be a world power, we need people for our armies. And so one of Teddy's many egregious lapses from liberalism. Yes. Now here we need more decibels. Oh, it's like running the marathon here. Thank you.
Sorry, I should enunciate. Was it hard to pick the dates, or was it a function of how much you wrote, that a sense you had to stop at 1919, or had you decided on that time span before you embarked?
Well, certainly length did factor into the equation.
I wondered, yeah.
But it's a defensible proposition. 1898 is the merger moment, and it's also the economic merger moment, and it's also, I didn't talk about it here, but the Spanish-Cuban-American War and the development of imperial outreach overseen by the New York World. And 1919 is a moment on the long-term transformation of the city's position on the planet, which is one of the probably the most altitude-driven approach. I mean, we start off being, after Lenape country, Pissant, little backwater of the Dutch Empire, an important provincial port in the English Empire momentarily until Alexander Hamilton sold us down the river, the Potomac River, the capital of the United States briefly, to becoming the critical interlink between industrializing Europe, the slave cotton-producing South, the wheat-producing small farmer Midwest, to being the headquarters of the new industrial organizations that grow up after the Civil War, to 1919, when New York is now clearly on a par with England. England survives, London survives, because it's got two things going for it. One, the empire. Two, not unrelated, the navy. And England is able to rally, London is able to maintain peer relationships. There are alliances that are struck between the House of Morgan and equivalent bodies on the English side. And it's only really at the end of the Second War that the power is transferred completely and ratified politically by the arrival of the United Nations. Originally, this volume was, in my lunatic fantasies, going to run from 1898 to 1945. So, in fact, a lot of stuff has been written on those 20s and 30s and 40s years. But when it became clear that it was cruising towards a page count of 3,000 and change, and clearly book binderies were not capable of dealing with such an artifact, we cut it in half. So volume 3, assuming all goes well and sufficient longevity, will cover from 1920 to 1945.